she is very much, on one level, an earth goddess and a priestess. She's the primary priestess archetype amongst this bunch of asteroids. And she's one of the so-called virginal goddesses, like Pallas. But in the ancient world, to be virginal meant not to be sexually intact or inexperienced, but to be able to concentrate energy and be contained, be whole within oneself, of not needing anybody, particularly any man, to complete her. So Vesta is like, she's a part yogini, part sacred prostitute, part priestess in the old Celtic traditions, and multi-skilled, multi-talented. But she's a quieter one who's just happy to be on her own. And nevertheless, she's spiritually very powerful because her containment is about concentrating not just energy, not just mental energy, but Shakti.
What if your birth chart was never broken, just incomplete? In this electrifying soul awakening episode, Daniel Sowelu, astrologer, spiritual pioneer, and guardian of the sacred feminine, reveals the missing half of astrology that most charts, books, and practitioners leave out. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. So together, we journey beyond planets and houses into the realm of asteroid goddesses: Medusa, Lilith, Kali, Ceres, Juno, and Vesta, and more. Archetypes so powerful they were buried, demonized, or forgotten entirely by patriarchal systems. But Daniel brings them back to life through radical embodiment, storytelling, and personal encounters that defy logic and rewire your soul. This episode is for the leaders, lovers, rebels, and healers who are done with watered-down spirituality and ready to meet the divine feminine in her full, untamed truth. Because your power was never lost. It was just waiting for you in the shadow. Enjoy. So welcome again, beautiful souls, to another episode. We've got a very special guest for you today. We've got someone that's actually close to where we are in this very moment. We have Daniel Sowelu. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for inviting me on, Catherine. I'm delighted to be here.
Yes, I know. I'm very delighted that you are here as well. And for those that don't know, we were just having a bit of a conversation. Daniel is also based in Australia. So as I was saying to Daniel, it's very rare, but it's nice to have someone nearby. So the way that we love to start the show is we always love to ask our guest, what inspired you to do what you do today?
What inspired? Well, it wasn't quite an inspiration. I was pushed. And like you, I had this total collapse when I was 24, and I initially trained as a biologist and a paleontologist, and but I had this radical spiritual opening when I was just before my 21st birthday. And that took me on a completely different pathway. I spent 4 years basically living like a monk in various ashrams, but I had to come back to the West. I had to come back to make some money. And I had a teaching certificate on top of my degree, and I thought, I can go teach high school for a bit. And I got parachuted into a senior master's position in a brand new high school, which was like incredibly stressful, but a brilliant opportunity. And I was doing really, really well. I love teaching, and particularly for the kids who were really, really receptive. But I was ignoring all these subtle signals that my body was starting to collapse under the stress. And one day I was in my favorite class, and I suddenly started dry retching. Yeah, which was a signal that I'd been pushing down all this stress. I hadn't been fully recovered from some illness in India, and suddenly what looked like a promising career direction just kind of splattered. I had to go on sick leave. I ended up resigning. And it was like a concertina of collapses. The first relationship I'd had in 6 years collapsed. My physical health was really challenged. I had no job, and I even blew up my car trying to get out of town. So it's just this, what I now see as a benevolent disaster, because my best friend was quite a good amateur astrologer, and he drew up my chart and said a couple of things to me which kind of clicked. And then he gave me a copy of a book, earmarked a couple of chapters, read this, this, and this. And this was Robert Hand's Planets in Transit. And not only did it describe much of what I had actually experienced, but more importantly, it described why. What was the overriding purpose of this whole experience? What was it trying to achieve by collapsing the life that I thought I was having? And you know, I'd done 5-6 years of university study, and I had never come across any knowledge of this quality that could be so helpful at a time of great crisis. But it didn't just explain what the crisis was about. I was at the end of a 30-year cycle. I'd been living a delusional life on some level, unaware of some of my real gifts. And so suddenly I had all this time, and I had this amazing thing called astrology. And I read and read mainly to help me understand myself, because a very elaborate form of psychology. The birth chart is the most articulate psychological map. And then, because I was so excited about this information, I started talking to others. And then someone asked me to if I'd have a look at their birth chart. And I said, yeah, okay, but I've only picked up my first book 6 weeks ago, so, you know, it could be a bit rough. But I went ahead anyhow, did my preparation. No computers in those days, so we had to calculate everything mathematically and astronomically. And I sat down with this person, and as soon as we started, it was like something just opened in me. And I spoke continuously for an hour and a half. And my scientific brain is watching this going, hey, you don't know this stuff. And the other part of me was in this subtle ecstasy, because some part of me did know this material. So that was the very beginning of what became my initial astrology practice. Yeah. Anyhow, my process still continued to be big. Big things happen. My mum died prematurely, and that pushed me into going into therapy. I started doing Jungian work, which I loved, then graduated onto doing more primal-like work, which is deep emotional release work in conjunction with the very beautiful Jungian worldview. Yeah, which dovetails so beautifully with astrology. So, you know, it wasn't by choice. And you know, if you had said to me at 18 that you had all these different skills in psychology and astrology, I would have said, well, what's that? Yeah. From a working class background, part Aboriginal, it's like I was stepping well beyond, you know, my family system by doing this. Yeah. So I'm grateful for the crash.
Yeah, I mean, and I always say things don't happen to us, right? They really do happen from us. And it sounded like there was more of a remembrance that was taking place.
Yeah.
And that's why you couldn't connect it. Sometimes logically you look at it especially when the right brain gets into gear and starts, downpouring this information. The left brain goes, hang on a minute, you're not meant to know this stuff, but it's within you. It's the information that you recalled and remembered. I love the fact that you talked about Jungian and psychology. Is that working with the information? Because I know I've done also a lot of work with Carl Jung's work, a lot of research in the archetypes and psychological archetypes, which I love. And I know that you really deep dive into the Asteroid Goddesses, which I'd love to understand. How did that all come about?
Well, the background behind this is that, see, when I learned the trade, and there are still astrologers, traditional astrologers who are doing this, the birth chart simply had the planets and a few other points. And it turns out that those charts were heavily biased towards the masculine, because even though astrology has its origins in earlier pre-Christian goddess traditions, the Greeks and Romans got to it, and they masculinized astrology to the situation where you've got 8 masculine archetypes and 2 feminine, which is just ridiculous, But that hung around for 2,000 years. And then about 60, 70 years ago, some intuitive astrologers were starting to link some of the asteroids from the asteroid belt with different faces of the re-emerging feminine. And this was just as feminism itself was seeding itself in our culture. And so what we've discovered is that if you start to incorporate some of the asteroids, because there's 22,000 of them, so there's a few much to choose from, it brings the chart into a much more realistic balance of masculine and feminine. And a lot of astrologers are now including Juno, Ceres, Pallas Athena, and Vesta. And that changed things quite profoundly for all of us. And then what happened is that, for me, around this time, is that I discovered and was introduced to a technique called experiential astrology. Now, experiential astrology is very different to the interpretive, analytical, chart reading kind of astrology. Because as you know, the chart is a map of archetypes. But in experiential astrology, you have images for the signs of the zodiac and symbols for the planets and asteroids. And you lay this circle out on the floor. So it becomes an astrological medicine wheel. And you bring either yourself or you bring your client into what is essentially a sacred space where they can energetically, emotionally, physically, intellectually connect directly with the energies of each archetype, whether it's a planet, whether it's an asteroid or a sign. And that totally changed the trajectory of my practice, because I'd been wanting to link my spiritual work, my therapeutic work, and my astrological work. And this wheel, this astrological wheel, was the perfect kind of pivot. And so that was something I developed in the last 35 years of my practice, during which time I started training people in this wheel work. And I attracted this amazing bunch of women who said, okay, we've done the planets. We want to work with not just the goddesses, but some of the dark goddesses too. So they encouraged me to bring in both, the four main asteroids, Pallas, Juno, Ceres, Vesta. But then we went on to working with Medusa, Lilith, Black Moon, Kali, the Dark Ladies, we like to call them. Yeah. Now, so that's how I kind of incorporated not just bringing in the feminine into the chart, but also of dropping into deeper layers of the sacred feminine, including the so-called dark goddesses. And that was another revolutionary point for us. Yeah.
I so love, and I'm smiling because it's exactly, I mean, I'm not an astrologist. I have been dancing in astrology since my mid-20s, and I'm in my late 50s. But I have, it's exactly what we do. So I have a coaching academy, and we also, because I've been dancing with the archetypes, because I've done a lot of research with Carl Jung, and it's exactly what you talk about. It's embodying the actual psychological archetype and how, as you're embodying that psychological archetype, what are you experiencing in that moment when you embody that archetype? And everyone has a different experience, whether it's the light or the shadow aspect, whether it's the highest vibration of the archetype or its lowest vibrational, but understanding how it plays out, because it does, even the darkest aspect have a purpose, right? And once we understand its purpose and what it's protecting us from, and what is our secondary gain, it's a game changer, because we see it for what it is and we can see it how it plays out. So I love the fact that you brought that up. For those that are really new to asteroids like Ceres, Pallas Athena, Juno, and Vesta, let's probably unpack. I'd love to really unpack their how they play out in a natal chart, and more so I think how they influence us and then our relationships. So maybe we could start with whichever one comes first.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, Ceres was the first one that was discovered. And Ceres' other name is Demeter. Her Greek name is Demeter. And she's an embodiment of the great Earth Mother. Yeah. Her symbol is the sickle, which talks about agriculture, it talks about corn, it talks about receiving the fruits of the earth. So she's a beautiful energy. And an easy way of looking at Ceres is that she's like a second moon, and yet she's more earthy than our regular moon. And as a therapeutic astrologer, one of the beauties about Ceres is that our moon represents a lot of our interrelationship with our mothers, both physically, emotionally, energetically. And if, like a lot of us, we have difficulties in that relationship that inhibits our connection to our deep emotions, Ceres is a part of the maternal feminine that isn't so entangled with our personal mothers. So it gives us an access point to this deeply loving, nurturing, very fertile, sensual energy. And she's one of the goddesses of women's mysteries, secret women's business, the blood mysteries, death, birth, rebirth. So she's quite amazing, in that respect. So, with people who have a traumatic relationship with their mothers, this is a place we will take them in the astrology wheel to connect with a healthier expression of the maternal feminine.
That's beautiful. Because when I see it as well, for me, it's like, it's how do we also give to ourselves, but how do we receive as well? Because I know that, I know a lot of women are good at giving, but not good at receiving. So I feel like Ceres is very much about how self-care, how do we care for ourselves, but how do we also accept care from others?
Yeah.
When I think about it. So thank you for that. How about we'll go to Pallas Athena next?
Pallas. Pallas is, she's a really interesting goddess. And she's a goddess who lives on the margin, often between the feminine and masculine. Yeah. Some of the information you read about that Pallas says, yeah, that's going to fit with, female politicians, female business people. And yet she's not just a warrior. She is a warrior energy. The Amazons were connected to her. But I love her because she bridges the deep feminine. And her symbol is the spearhead. And part of that symbolism is to pierce into a masculine patriarchal world so that the intelligence of the feminine can express itself creatively. So she's that part of the feminine that's not so maternal, but wants a vital life that's intellectually stimulating, spiritually significant, and where she can make her mark in the world. Yeah. Another aspect of Pallas is that she's like a higher and spiritually more powerful octave than Mercury, the planet of the mind. So she's a point of brilliance in each of us. Yeah. So she's quite unique. In some of her mythology, she didn't have a mother. She was born out of her father's head. So she's a chip off the old block, mythologically speaking. Yeah. And her father is Zeus. Yeah. Now, Juno is the traditional goddess of marriage, committed relationship. She's a queen energy. Yeah. She's married to Zeus. So she's said to be the Greco-Roman queen of heaven. Like Zeus, she can be very expansive, very progressive, very graceful. And yet some of the stuff you read about her has to do with her marital problems with her husband. Now, keeping in mind, this is the Greco-Roman version, which again is seen through the lens of their worldview. But in her mythology, Zeus just acts like a randy adolescent and has sex with whoever and whatever he comes across. Whereas she is this deeply committed goddess of quality, equal relationship. So his philandering enrages her, according to this myth. So instead of acting out her rage on him, she acts her rage out on his demigod children he has to all these illicit matings. And so she has this reputation, which is overstated in a lot of territory, as just being this vengeful, jealous wife. But in truth, when you connect with her experientially, she is that part of the feminine that radiates this regal quality. And that in itself demands and often attracts a male counterpart who can meet her. Yeah. And so she's deeply committed to quality connection based on equality on all levels. Yeah. So she has a lot to do with when we step beyond Venus and Mars, when we step beyond the honeymoon and start to then get into the nuts and bolts of quality relationship, where ideally both people are evolving their king and queen archetypes. So that's where Juno plays out. Yeah.
It's interesting because I'm looking at that when you're talking about the archetypes, the feminine and the masculine, even when you were just talking about Pallas Athena, when you were talking, I mean, to me, I was really like thinking about the wisdom keeper. You know, that's that quite strategic in the way, and being quite expansive in that way, to the point where she could be more creative, she could solve those problems. And then when you stepped into Juno, I felt like the partnership, the commitment, but then there was the opposite, the dichotomy at play within the male and the masculine, which I'd love to unpack that. But let's go to the next one, which was Vesta.
Now Vesta, Vesta is the quieter one of the four. She is very much, on one level, an earth goddess and a priestess. She's the primary priestess archetype amongst this bunch of asteroids. And she's one of the so-called virginal goddesses, like Pallas. But in the ancient world, to be virginal meant not to be sexually intact or inexperienced, but to be able to concentrate energy and be contained, be whole within oneself, of not needing anybody, particularly any man, to complete her. So Vesta is like, she's a part yogini, part sacred prostitute, part priestess in the old Celtic traditions, and multi-skilled, multi-talented. But she's a quieter one who's just happy to be on her own. And nevertheless, she's spiritually very powerful, because her containment is about concentrating not just energy, not just mental energy, but Shakti, the sacred energy of the feminine. And like Pallas, is then able to express that energy very powerfully. It's like almost laser-like into the world. Yeah. So she holds a big space, but she also helps us kind of get supremely focused, and which she also shares with Pallas.
I mean, I'm even looking at the glyph when you're looking about the container, and then the fire element, which is that spiritual aspect that you just speak about, which is very, very sacred indeed. So looking at these asteroids, and I love that the feminine archetypes. How do we? So when we look at the charts, obviously, when you're looking at the charts, what do you look for? Do you look at whether there is an imbalance within the touch with the charts within the feminine and the masculine? Because I was asking you that right at the start. I said I'm really curious to see how do we bring in the balance of the masculine, because I agree with you. It's very much about how do we, with the asteroids and the planets, how do we allow them to be like we can actually, because they're all, I mean, there's a dichotomy at play all the time, right? So there's going to be one aspect and the other aspect. But how do we sit knowing that they are both at play at the same time?
Whoa, hey, that's a big question. Well, I guess what I want to say about that is that, as you know, the last 20 odd years in particular, there's been this popularized and rightful theme around reclaiming the feminine, whether we're male or female, and so important, like absolutely important for our survival as a species, let alone for our own inner well-being. However, at some point, you've got to turn around, having owned and connected with the feminine, and to recreate a different dynamic with the masculine. Yeah. And people don't talk enough about this. Like, it's all very fine to own the feminine, and she will itself start to shift the way the masculine expresses within ourselves. But the other parallel process is deconstructing the versions of masculinity and how they express through us as well. So that eventually we're heading towards, a greater union and essentially a sacred marriage between masculine and feminine. So it's a matter of doing both. So you can't just go off and work with the feminine and ignore the masculine, which is what a lot of people are doing, because the masculine hasn't grown enough to be able to welcome her in to create a new union. Yeah. Does that make sense?
100%, because you're looking at how do we coexist in this together, right? Because from it, if we chunk it right up, we are whole, we are one system, we are one. So even though there's, different parts within that system, it's how do we coexist and understanding how these play out. How they play out, not just individually. Obviously, I think that I'd like to really find out maybe a story that, or two that you'd like to share how this has played out. But obviously the merging and integration, because that's what, we talk a little bit about when we talk about psychological archetypes, when they come up. Let's say, a saboteur or an inner critic, I always say you can't kill it, you can't strangle it, you can't drown it. You've got to give it space to be seen, heard, and valued, and you can only integrate it, because that's where the magic happens, right? This is when you understand it plays a part, you understand its purpose. So how do I work with it? And so I understand that these archetypes, whether they're playing at the highest expression or the lowest expression, it's about how do we integrate them and work with them, understanding their strengths. And how can we draw from those strengths when we use them? Because that's how I see that. This is how I work with archetypes. Is sometimes if I feel like I need a little bit more Mars in me, a little bit more courage, a little bit more assertiveness, I will draw on an archetype and really imagine, and what would that feel like if I embodied that archetype to do the thing that I need to do to give me that little extra push or assertiveness to have that courageous conversation. Yeah. And so I'm sure we can do that with all archetypes, but I'd love to hear some stories that you've experienced for yourself or that you've seen within your community when you've worked with these archetypes and integrated them and used them with their fullest expression.
Well, yeah, thanks for describing the way you work with, say, Mars energy. In this astrological wheel work, if someone's wanting to do that, then we'd bring them into the wheel. We'd take them out to Mars, and there's a ritual way of approaching this that will flush out blockages to our connection with the Mars energy. So you do a bit of release work, trusting whatever bubbles up in the person. And then by the time they get out to the Mars symbol, they're more available to connecting with its essence. Yeah. So we do that with Mars, and then we'll go and find the person's Venus and do a similar process with Venus. So they're connecting more deeply with their Venus energy, flushing out obstacles, maybe releasing some old resentment towards the masculine. It's to clear a way for the two to unite. And there are a number of ways you can unite them. You can use psychodrama, for instance, to get a dialogue happening between the two. So they work out between themselves how to improve the relationship. Or you can symbolically bring their two symbols, Venus and Mars, together within the center of the circle, and to actually drop in and feel those two energies within their body. Yeah. So this is one of the ways that we work the same territory. The main thing about working with the masculine, though, is with every male archetype, there is a patriarchal overlay. whether we call that the critic or the dream stealer, whatever names you want to give it, it applies to virtually all, our suns, our Mercuries, our Jupiters. And so that's part of the dismantling so that that deeper essence can come through. And often that deeper essence is far more available to the feminine. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I've got a story. And this is our leaning into the dark goddesses. One of the dark goddesses, the famous ones, is Medusa. Yeah. And Medusa has this horrible, horrible reputation, some of which is understandable, but mostly people just know her, oh, yeah, she's that Gorgon who turns men to stone. Like she's this vicious, evil, vengeful. And she can be that in her distorted form. But if you look at her myth, she was dealt such a bad deck of cards by life. She was born a beautiful mortal. And her beauty was such that she attracted the attention of Poseidon, whose other name is Neptune. And Neptune, being a very powerful seducer, seduces this beautiful young mortal and either rapes her or has sex with her in the temple of Pallas Athena, which is a violation of the sanctity of that temple. Pallas Athena hears about this. Instead of blaming Poseidon because he had the power, she blames Medusa and turns her into this ugly hag and encourages all the men to project their own darkness onto her, which got perpetuated over centuries. So she became more and more toxic, more destructive, and then, eventually morphed into this very, very scary part of self that no one wants to go near, understandably. Yeah. However, underneath that story, she is quite different. Now, how I came to know this, deeply in myself, this is about 15, 18 years ago. I was coming out of the end of a kinesiology session. There was nothing archetypal or anything we're working with, just working with energies in my body. And we're doing a bit of a debrief at the end of the session. And suddenly this energy comes into the room. And it was so palpable that both of us stopped talking. And just the feeling of like, we have to, tune into this. So we closed our eyes. And in my vision, I'm looking up here, and there appears this drop-dead, gorgeous woman with a sari-like material wrapped around a voluptuous body, cascading wild curly locks, just like kind of awesome, beautiful, and obviously very erotic. And I'm kind of in my inner vision looking at her, but I can think, nah, there's something else going on here. So I said to her, who are you really? And what she did was she then swung her face this way and flashed me her Gorgon face, her snakes and all. And then she turned back and smiled sweetly. So I kind of, okay, I know who you are now. And she came in closer in my vision, and I can feel the tears around this, is that she poured this heart-melting, unconditional love into me. And I just felt like I was becoming a puddle. It was so sublime, so beautiful, so incredibly loving. And I've only experienced that once in my life, and that was in contact with an authentic spiritual master. And and then she came in, and she came in really close in her beautiful form. And she said, I don't want you to touch me. I just want you to meet me. And in that meeting, she showed me she has the ability to create crystalline boundaries, but boundaries that also are semi-permeable, so that love, beauty, Shakti, sacred feminine power. And it was very much a tantric experience I was having with her. And indescribably potent, powerfully erotic in a deeply mystical sense. Yeah. And then she kind of let me go and then started to, kind of fade back in. But the cheeky part of myself said, can you send me someone like you? And then she disappeared. And she did. But not one, not two, but 3 different women over the next decade. And each of those women astrologically had very powerful Medusa energies. The first 2, they were great love affairs, and they cracked my heart wide open, but then just turned into disasters. Yeah. And yet, in retrospect, I saw that each one of those was a way the Dark Mother was purifying energies in me in preparation for meeting my now partner, who is a Venus Medusa woman. Yeah. So that I love telling that story because it says to people, don't believe the Greek or Roman myths. They only focus on the toxic distortions. The darkest, most destructive goddesses underneath are still expressions of the great loving mother.
Absolutely. I mean, I was just thinking that too as you were speaking about it. Of course, I mean, if one exists, I mean, then one cannot exist without the other. They need to coexist. So even like some of the darker sides of these goddesses, there is also that. I think the almost like the darker, the lighter aspects are like, it's like that diamond in the mud. If you really tap in, tune into it, you can see it. So I love the fact you talked about that. What would be unpacking some of the other ones like Black Moon Lilith? Let's talk about some of the other darker side of the goddesses.
Well, the Lilith story is another great one. Lilith was originally, she was a Sumerian, some say goddess, some say attendant to some of the great Sumerian goddesses. Anyhow, she got absorbed into early versions of the Old Testament as the first partner of Adam. And theoretically, she was born to, be the wife of Adam. So she comes in as this, and because she comes from a more ancient goddess tradition, she comes in as this super powerful woman who demands equality from him on every level. And this is Middle Eastern pre-Christian, pre-Judeo-Christian culture. You imagine how well that goes down. Yeah. And Adam can't meet her. He can't deal with her. He doesn't know what to do with her. So he denies her intelligence, her potency. He belittles her. But she came into the story like a higher octave of Juno, committed to the creation of high quality relationship. So what does she do? And this is where a lot of women laugh. She hangs in the hope that he's going to change. And of course, he doesn't. And so her level of resentment, her bitterness, and not having her love or her intelligence received, gets to the point where she either engineers exile or she chooses exile. And she goes out into the desert, wounded, traumatized, angry. And out of that, she meets demons in the desert and she mates with those demons. And out of those matings, she gives birth to multiple demonic babies. In the meantime, Adam speaks to his father, and his father sends out, allegedly the good guys, angels, to say to Lilith, you need to go back to Adam or we're going to take your children away. And she says, no, I'm not going back. And so she loses her children. And this is where she does the first of major transmutation. She turns into this demonic, vengeful, toxic creature with wings beautifully alluring and talons. And she acts out her pain by stealing and murdering other people's babies and acting as a femme fatale, ripping men off of their sexual energy, their sexual potency. Horrible, horrible story. This stage of Lilith was the origin of the vampires. Yeah, she even has teeth in some of her imagery. So once again, the patriarch says, yes, see, the deep feminine is dark, toxic, vengeful. You have to control it, suppress it. But after leaving a trail of destruction through an extraordinary act of grace from somewhere else than the religious paradigm, she discovers she has the power to transform and transmute her pain and her rage, so that out of which she then metamorphoses back into a maturer version of that original potency. And then she comes to embody the truly empowered woman, who's embodied by that beautiful painting of Collier's, where the serpent is wrapped around her naked body. But it's important to understand how that empowerment looks, because she's empowered because her warrior energies are here and present and protective of her if needed. And they can move in if there's any threat, and they can get out of the way when they're not needed. Because they're there and available, her sensitivity, her vulnerability, her psychic gifts, her spiritual gifts also become a form of empowerment from within herself. And with that combination, she is fully able to be totally comfortable in her body, in her sexuality, as an expression of the sacred feminine. And out of that, she radiates this kind of force field that deflects negative, particularly sexual attention. But there's a doorway that's always open for a man who can meet her on all those levels, spiritually, emotionally, sexually, psychologically. Yeah. So you don't hear a lot about that last metamorphosis. You only hear about, again, the destructive face of hers. And so part of my work, whether in the wheel, whether in primal therapy, is about supporting the release of whether personal rage and trauma or carried rage and trauma from our family systems or even from our culture. Because you've got to get down there and flush the toxins out. Because like anything else, Catherine, you know, any archetype that is buried in us will turn around to bite us. If we bury the dark goddesses in ourselves, that's a recipe for generations of mental illnesses, suicidal tendencies, toxic behavior, belief systems. There's so much trauma that gets created, which is at the core of our worst self-sabotage mechanisms. It also distorts our sacred sexuality and produces major obstacles to intimacy. Whereas if you can get down and really work to release the distortions, then the opposite is true. Like Medusa showed me, it's like you can have really, really good boundaries and still be amazingly open. You can live from your pure sacred tantric sexuality. When you get down to these goddesses, you don't have to practice tantra. Tantra happens. And any person who interacts with you sexually will in turn be transformed. So there's so much giftedness, including powerful spiritual warriors that we're going to desperately need, particularly in this next 4 years. So working with the dark goddesses allow us to access levels of fierce but loving sacred feminine that can make a real difference.
I love the way that you've described that, because it is true. I mean, when you're thinking about, I mean, there is a lot of talk about the sacred feminine, whether you're a male or a female, doesn't really matter, because we have both that resides within us. But even like talking and expanding about the dark goddesses, I think that also it's almost like we're bringing light to them. Yeah. We're allowing them to be seen for who they truly are, rather than a story, believing a narrative or a story or what we've read about them. We're allowing ourselves to experience and really embody them for who they are. And that in itself would be very transformative. I mean, I myself, as you were speaking, I could actually tap into some of them that you were talking about, because I'm like, well, that sounds a bit like me. You know, but at what cost, right? When you allow that darker aspect of the goddess to reside within you, you got to ask yourself, at what cost? What are the consequences for you hanging on to that? Yeah. Which is really, really fascinating. And I love the fact that you even talked about, because I think we were talking about primal therapy. I mean, I think that would help release trauma, and also by doing that, then we're really we're able to reconnect with our true self, right? So doing the deep work is not always comfortable. No, it's not. But I am curious about and I am also conscious of your time as well, but I'm curious about, what are you foreseeing the next 4 years? So for us to really tap into those darker aspects of the goddesses, to tap into those archetypes and understand how they play out and how we can work with them, why do you think we need them for the next 4 years? What made you say that?
A number of things. Obviously, there's the Trump factor, but also like one of the other dimensions of the distorted dark feminine is that in a man's psyche, the energy manifests paradoxically as misogyny. which includes misogynistic attitudes to the world, to nature, to other civilizations, other cultures, other races. So when this deep sacred feminine is so buried, it actually negatively empowers the destructive masculine. So you see that all over the planet currently. Yeah. As I said, all the dark goddesses are latent sacred warriors. Yeah. My friend and colleague, Andrew Harvey, talks about a lot of the dark goddesses have sharp weapon symbolism, like Kali's sword, for instance. And Andrew, what Andrew says about Kali's sword is, in order to use this sword well as activists in the world, we have to clean our swords. That is, we have to work with our own personal crap, our own carried distortions, so that instead of going out into the world with a blunt instrument which is already rusting and we do more damage, you go out into a world with a very refined surgical intellect and ability to direct spiritual power to elicit change when it becomes available. Yeah. A really good example of that is Marianne Williamson. Like, you see her get up unscripted in big audiences and just slice and dice the patriarch in ways that are sassy and brilliant and surgical. Yeah. So that's a dimension. The other thing is the planets of transformation, the three outer ones, Neptune, Pluto, and Uranus, are coming into their own convergence, not exactly together, but from different places of the zodiac. And each of those represents huge collective changes, both deep change, radical change, but also potentially mystical change. And so that's going to put the squeeze on all our processes internally, on our transformative and spiritual processes. But as you said, like, you can't have transformation without a series of psychic or psychological deaths of the old, cutting away ego structures that limit our capacity to express potently in the world. But also on a civilization level, it's really clear, we could destroy the place in a second if things went really bad. There's an Australian comedian, I forget his name, and he was asking an American audience, he says, "What's this Trump business?" And he kind of ponders a bit and he says, "Oh, I know. You want to see how fucked up things could really get." And there's a certain truth in that. For however toxic and horrible a person Trump is, some energy is using him to break up as a vehicle of breaking up old structures that aren't working. And their structures he absolutely believes in. There's nothing benevolent about what he's trying to do. But he's also being used by some greater powers to break up the economic system, the political system. Out of the mess he creates is going to be opportunities for the sacred feminine, for more enlightened expressions in our cultural lives, in our political lives. So yeah, it's going to get messy. We know that. And hopefully no one is stupid enough to press a button, because if it comes to that, sometimes civilizations have died before. Yeah.
Yes, 100%. And you know, it's the way that you were speaking. I just got a picture of Pluto and Capricorn moving out of that hole, the destructions and the breaking down of the, you know, finance, education, and medical. So it was very much as you were talking. I was like, oh, it's speaking about Pluto. So I am very conscious of your time, Daniel. And so the way that we love to wrap up our session is we always love to leave our audience with 3 shiny golden nuggets. So what would be those 3 shiny golden nuggets that you would like to leave for our audience?
Okay. Purifying the goddess, particularly the dark goddess energies, it demands multi-focuses spiritually and therapeutically, as well as learning to love these goddesses. But on a day-to-day level, one of my teachers said to us, every emotion is a Shakti. That is, every emotion we have, whatever its nature, whatever its quality, is an expression of the goddess. Therefore, we must honor our emotions. And so that it challenges us to check in on a day-to-day level. What's happening in my body? What am I feeling? What you do with your emotions is your business, but you have to feel and acknowledge them because they are expressions of our deep feminine. That's a way we start to reverse our disembodiment, our disassociations, our anesthetizations. Yeah. So simply by feeling your feelings. Yeah. Now we talked about the toxic dimension of distorted feminine energy. And of course, there's the masculine parallel. There's a beautiful and simple but powerful meditation that was given to me by my friend Andrew Harvey, called the Golden Kali meditation. And it's a meditation that if something triggers you in your life or strong emotions come up or you wake up in the middle of the night with your mind racing or feeling really toxic or nauseous, you sit down and visualize the golden form of Kali and invite her to sit opposite you. And you use your breath to draw up those toxins and your out breath to offer them to her. It's very simple and yet very powerful. And she receives that energy, transmutes it in her own body, and sends it back in the form as powerful golden light. It's a life-saving meditation when we're in severe crisis, yeah, and we don't know what to do with our energy, yeah. And it's another way of connecting with these gorgeous primal goddesses. And I've forgotten the third one. And as for astrology readings, for any of you out there, if you're going to have an astrology reading, check in with the astrologer to see what asteroids they're including in the chart, on the basis that if they're not including any asteroids, you'll get a reading that is skewed towards the masculine. And so it's going to be astrologers who are working actively with these different faces of the feminine that brings the chart into a much realistic balance of masculine and feminine.
I love that. I love all 3 of them. And of course, we will have everything in the show notes. Daniel, where do you hang out the most?
Where do I?
What platform do you hang out the most?
Facebook primarily.
Okay. Yeah. Amazing. And obviously for those that are interested in seeing you, they can see you virtually. It doesn't have to be face to face.
Yeah.
Okay. Amazing, amazing. I want to say thank you. It's been such an extraordinary, like I said, we haven't had anyone talk about the asteroids, and I was really fascinated. And I'm so grateful that you brought in the asteroids and the goddesses, even the dark ones, because I think that they all play a part in all of our lives, and I could relate to quite a few of them. So, thank you so much for your time, your energy, and your wealth of wisdom. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure.